be with Jay Stanford. Now, we've been friends for a long time, over a couple of decades. We've worked on many projects together. But Jay, you're the head of climate change, the environment, and waste management, correct? At the city.
That's correct. It's a long title, Glenn, but it seems my title has changed over the years. But you can call me anything you want. I just really love working here at the City of London.
That's great. And how many years have you been with the city, Jay?
Oh, geez, I think I'm just about shy of 27 years. So
Yeah, it's a long time. You've seen a lot of change in that time. I did want to talk to you a bit about. I want to do two sessions, which you have agreed to, which I really appreciate. Next week, I want to get more into the climate change idea and other things. But for now, the food bank and the city and your department have had a partnership that's gone on for a long time. And it really started over 2 decades ago, I think, when your department and talked with us, and you had put together an idea of how we could link together some of what you were doing, and also with food security, what the food bank was doing. I'd be interested if you could just let the people that are watching know how that came together, because we weren't really part of that. That was something you were designing with your team at the beginning at the city, and then we talked about it, and it was great. Can you just go over those beginnings?
yeah, it is fascinating, Glenn. Um, when you think back, so the environment and who gets involved in that. So the environment often doesn't have a voice, right? We rely on people to represent that voice. And
Yeah.
so over the years, we were hearing from community groups, um, and they were kind of the voice of the environment. And, as loud as they were trying to be, often the message just was a lower priority compared to other things. And we're talking here now, 25, almost 30 years ago. And at the same time, though, and learning from folks like, in the early days with the food bank and my experience elsewhere, often the voice of poverty was a lower priority for many, and often a voice not often heard, in part because the challenges that many people in communities in London and elsewhere uh, were so significant, they didn't have time for loud action
Yeah.
and they weren't being heard. So if you looked at the parallels between poverty and the environment, you realize that there's a lot of similarities. There's always been the need for more action, but sometimes the voices just were diluted. And at the city here with a number of my colleagues, we sat back and sort of said, is there a way to sort of look at both of them combined? And were there some parallels? And we clearly saw the parallels. And this is where we said, well, what's the commonality? Well, the commonality is good people rising to the challenge. And we saw that time and time again with the environment. And being on the environment side, I wasn't really fully aware what was occurring on the poverty side. But when I saw the parallels, I said, you know what? Let's see if we can actually align some of these together. And this, if you recall, Glenn, is when we really began to approach the food bank and say, geez, we know you're already involved in some good environmental things because you were involved in Christmas tree recyclings, almost since day one, almost like an odd addition to the food bank, but something that you and the volunteers and others there said, no, this is part of being in a good community. So I think some of those early initiatives, not only was the food bank around doing good things with food and getting food into the hands of those that needed it,
Yeah.
but the notion of tying together with the environment, there were some early wins. And I think that's what prompted a closer relationship between the city and the food bank on the environment.
Yeah, you just reminded me. I'd forgotten all about that. But in those early days, we did the Christmas tree pickups. There were depots around the city, but we had the food bank volunteers
Yes.
collect them as people dropped them off, and then they were mulched by the city and put into parks. But they needed a group of volunteers, and we had a broad network, so we did it. And the other thing was the telephone books. For a number of years, we did telephone books, and it was because they couldn't be recycled because of the glue and the binding. And so I still have a sore back. I think Jane does from those days, Jay, because they were so heavy, the skids and kids of phone books. We would send them down to Cascade Products down in Quebec, and
Yeah.
from there they were able to do something about it. And then all of a sudden, there was a glue that could be used that was recyclable. right? And that was it. Then people could put their phone books into the blue boxes, and that suddenly saved our backs, and and that was great. But you were right that we had an interest in the environment back then, and I know that the folks in your department had an interest in poverty. What's interesting is that they've both kind of become mainstream, right? Like when I think of the environment, I mean, obviously now it's everywhere. We're not perhaps being as effective as we can with things like climate change, but we're much more aware of it now than we were. And poverty is the same.
Yeah.
So I find it really interesting that you and your team had pioneered this idea of bringing those two things together before that mainstream part happened. And we were able to find a link to it. Now, you came up with an innovative idea as to how to make that happen, and that was through the use of the blue box. Can you talk to us about that for a bit? Because I wouldn't have thought of that at that time.
Yeah, this is one of those things where a lot of good people getting together, ideas start to formulate, right? So
Yeah.
so this is back in 1997. So a fellow by the name of Brad Muter, and he was a part of our the group running our local recycling contract.
Yeah.
They at the time, I think they were called Laidlaw. Then their name changed to Waste Management. And so they actually approached the city and said, look, recycling is growing in interest. Have you thought of this idea? And they raised this notion that they were aware of a community in Ontario, and forget the name now, it might have been Mississauga, that over a 2-day period ran a blue box food drive. And they achieved certain success. And so it was one of those things where we mulled it over as a team here and said, well, if we're going to do this, how do we bring it to all Londoners? Because recycling, was something that was being well received by Londoners back in 1997. So we said, we could make this work. We'll need a few partners. We'll need some people to understand what we're trying to achieve. We approached the food bank. Of course, at that point, we were approaching Jay and Roy on a regular basis and saying, what about growing some new ideas? And Jane, I believe, brought it to yourself and a few other board members and said, sure, let's give it a try. And especially if there are going to be other partners brought forward. And we said, yes, it will need a team of volunteers. So back in this goes way back in time, 1997, we launched the first London Cares curbside food drive. And at the time, I'll tell you, it's, what's that term, flying by the seat of your pants? Because there was no manual to fall back on. All there was good people saying, we're going to give this a good college try. We're going to make it work. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed that Londoners will understand what we're trying to do. And if you remember, Glenn, this was the novel idea. On your recycling day, you were going to place at the curb in a bag and maybe tie a ribbon around it, a bag of non-perishable food items. So most likely, in a tin can or a cardboard container. And the recycling operator was going to, at the same time as picking up the blue box, place that bag into the cab of the vehicle. And then we'd arrange for some offloading in the community. And I'll tell you what, in our first year, we were amazed. Mm-hmm. We're absolutely amazed. And if you recall, and I still look back at the numbers on a regular basis, 36,000 pounds came in. And 95% of those pounds came from the curb, because we still relied on grocery stores. They were the partners. The other partner, if you recall, Glenn, was a group called Corporations Supporting Recycling. And so they found this to be a novel idea because they were taking a very community-oriented program, the recycling program, and putting it to this additional use, another community benefit, to raise food for the food bank. And I'll tell you, we were all tickled pink after that first year when we said, wow, it worked. And Londoners embraced it. It was just a wonderful addition to traditional food drives, but with this unique twist. And I think that unique twist was what carried us through the early years.
Yeah. I think too, Jay, your team asked us when would be the right time to do that. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And the timing actually was everything in this, because we lived back in those days, back in the 90s, on the basis of food drives. Right. So our final food drive before the summer was actually the spring food drive, the one that we had done with the free press where the bags go in the paper. That was usually March or April. And then we had to try to get by until September and October to our Thanksgiving food drive. So there
Yes.
was a real time in there where we went into the summer and didn't have much in the way of supplies. And it was you and your team that came to us and said, if that's the time, that would be the best time to do it, even weather-wise for your head, for you guys. Do I have that right? I think that's how that happened.
Absolutely. So we were targeting what was late May, early June, and the early June became sort of enough of a gap between the Thanksgiving food
Yeah.
drive and
Yeah.
this notion of what you've just described. So yes, it became known as stocking the shelves for the summer months. And as
Yeah. I
it's
remember.
still today, things do get a little bit more quiet at the food bank over those summer months. It might have changed a little, but that was the tradition for the first. I'll tell you, when I look back, the first 10 years. So remember, so 36,000 pounds in year one. And then as we move forward, and when we look back after the first 10 years, we had hit the 5,000, 570,000 pound mark. So to
Mm.
repeat, 570,000 pounds. And not only had we, of course, had more Londoners involved, but it was the partnership that grew.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was so important. By after 10 years, we went from 5 partners to 14. We had at least 6 grocery store chains involved, and our local media. And this is where they're so important to help raise the awareness. There was not really a competition amongst the media, it was a collaboration among the media to help raise awareness and make sure Londoners knew that there was this unique opportunity to participate, a very convenient opportunity, but just as important, the ongoing awareness that food drives were a key part of the food bank at that point in time. So we're talking now, the mid 2000s, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I know you said Mississauga had tested this out for a couple of days, but really this became the model that was used across the country. Is that not true? Do I have that right? Other municipalities looked at what London was doing and also made that link. Is that correct?
It is, but it's always fascinating because we once again we look back and sometimes London is, why does it work in London and doesn't work elsewhere? So it wasn't for lack of trying. So places like the town of Niagara, so in the Niagara region, they ran a food drive, and the last one on record was about 2005. My notes would show City of Chilliwack out in British Columbia.
Yeah.
They ran a food drive in 2004. And then Greater Sudbury, their last one was 2002. So we had chatted with them out there, and they just they thought it was great. They tried it. It was the volunteer base that they couldn't
Yeah.
maintain. And it was that partnership that became the unique characteristic here in London, that they get the curbside component, but the group of partners, starting originally with environmental partners, but after the 10 years, we started to have groups such as Budweiser Gardens. They were called the John Labatt Center at that time.
Mhm.
They came forward. We had Try Recycling. We had St. Leonard's Society. All these groups coming forward and saying they're part of a volunteer base, whether they are true volunteers or employees, they began to work with it.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, that was when the growth really began to occur. And we began to put up some really, really big numbers and to get ready for those summer months.
Yeah. But then it morphed, right? We began to look at it and realize that the community itself was changing, the blue box thing was changing as well. And so we began, and it was a very mutual thing, I remember, between us and the city. We began talking more about fresh food as opposed to curb hunger. It didn't mean that the hunger thing wasn't still going on, but it was the idea that more and more communities were waking up to the knowledge that if we're going to help the people of low income or people on the margins, just non-perishable items wasn't the way to go. So you and your team again got together and sat down with us and said, how could we morph this into a fresh food kind of capacity? How did that happen? How did that take place?
Well, you know, once again, a whole bunch of good minds together. But I also think, though, we were hearing from Londoners, and
Yeah, I agree.
Londoners wanted to drop off fresh fruit. And the idea with the curbside program, well, that clearly didn't make any sense.
Yeah,
So I think
non-perishable.
there we were taking a page from Londoners and also the food bank, because Glenn, as you recall, you started to see that as well on a regular basis. How
Yeah,
can I drop off items from my garden, for example, or how can I actually pick up perishable items from the grocery store and
Yeah.
get them to the food bank. So I think it was a combination of a bunch of things, including people becoming more knowledgeable that nutritious food are not only good for you and I, but are also equally important for people in need.
Yeah. That's really true. And and one of the things that just shot it through the roof for us, I think we were roughly around 25% of the food that we were giving out was fresh, right? So that was great. We were picking up steam, but we continue to hear from the public that they wish they had an easier way of doing it, because they couldn't drop it off at one of the bins at the grocery store because we might not pick it up for 2 or 3 days, right? And then, we sat down with you and we started talking about grocery stores and surplus food at grocery stores that often ended up at landfills, right?
Right.
And we talked, and I know that was a challenge for you. Your department was looking at how can we avoid that? How can we divert it from landfill? And I know that we as a food bank were looking for more ways as to how to get more fresh food into the food bank. How did that come about?
Well, I think this is where, once again, things were starting to align in this notion of we're the growing season. It's the summer food drive.
Yeah.
What can we take advantage of? And so different ideas came into play. We had the grower row. Could Londoners grow an extra row of fresh food in their home gardens and get it to the food bank? And the answer was tick, yes.
Hmm.
The food bank, you folks there, anytime there's a new idea, with you and your volunteers, you always make it work. So that could be accommodated. So then, you know, okay, so how do we continue to grow that idea? This fresh food at grocery stores that you just described. In fact, it was, the food bank working with the Canada Food Banks group saying, this is a problem Canada-wide. So here in London, we have this problem. Healthy or fresh produce going to the landfill site because we don't have a mechanism to recover it. Well, when you really think about it, we've got to now step back to the grocery store. And I think it was some of the early days with you folks in 2017, where a number of your grocery stores that were so happy to participate in food drives said, look, if we can help in a different way and not have to send this to landfill, it's going to be win-win for the grocery store, win-win for the food bank.
Yeah.
So here at the city, we said, geez, if we can help in any way to push this along, it'll be in our best interest because we don't want this in our landfill site. Let's face it here. These are items that break down and contribute to greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
They create methane in the landfill site. So this, of course, became a win-win for the city. And we sort of said to you folks at the food bank, how can we help you become more successful? And I think, though, with your network of the grocery stores that are involved now, just about all are involved in one way or another. And it is incredible what has grown out of that, because let's look at, so our food drive over 25 years, we've recovered about 1.5 million pounds of food, or the equivalent of 1.5 million pounds of food. So over 25 years, one of the longest running food drives in Canada, the work we're doing. But
Yeah.
when you look at the contribution that comes just from the grocery store, the Community Refresh program, where grocery stores are saying, we don't want to send this out to the dumpster. We want to have that recovery system. Since 2017, looking at the numbers that have been compiled now, we're looking at about 1.8 million pounds of food have come in over a 5-year period.
Wow.
That's incredible. And that's due to the great work of your volunteers, your employees at the food bank, the work of the grocery stores, and that whole network, because it is truly just in time. You've got to get it just in time at the grocery store. You've got to get it stocked on shelves, stored into fridges, and then distributed to the community. It's not like it's perishable, right? It's not a can that can sit on a shelf, as you pointed out. So that growth was tremendous. And in fact, the model in London right now is one that is beginning to be replicated elsewhere in Canada, because it is working so well. And I know the success with your colleagues at the Canada Food Banks, they look at London as a model that is working really, really well.
Yeah. And it accelerated so rapidly. It was like liftoff at Cape Kennedy. It was, we were at around 25% of our food, and then suddenly we were up at 50.
Yeah.
And now we're up at around 55. Now, I know we have the greenhouse at the food bank, and we'll talk about that another time. But really, it was the food from the grocery stores that was diverted and came to the food bank that suddenly gave the food bank this huge amount of fresh food we were able to not just give out to ourselves, but the 30 other agencies that we also help, right? We had to get that out quickly to them. But I think it really, the public, the community in London really wanted more fresh food out there and making it happen. But this happened way faster than what I thought it would. And I think part of it is that we already had a relationship with the grocery stores, as you have already said. But also you at the city and your department, you helped put that together. And then we kind of shared on a position of somebody who would approach grocery stores and let them know of these opportunities. And that's what really did it. And then Business Cares got involved. So that's
Yes.
that group of over 500 businesses. They got involved and say, hey, look, we would like to provide you a vehicle that would help you do the picking up, so on and so forth. So now we're a food bank who over half of what we give out is fresh food,
Yeah.
perishable food. That's just since 2017. That would not have happened if we as a food bank had tried to take that on our own. I also think for you as a city, it would have been difficult to try to make that happen without a volunteer network.
Oh,
And for the business community, they wanted to help and they were looking for something to do. And it just we all had our strengths and we all brought them to the table and it just worked so quickly. It's a phenomenal thing.
it really is. And, it's a, you know, you got to say thanks to so many people.
Yeah.
And I think anytime you have a program that survives this long, there's going to be changes. And you always hope the changes are for the better. And for the most part, they have been. Well, we've had a few light years where other priorities, were more important for Londoners. So our numbers did go up and down. But, to be still doing this, heading into our 26th year,
Yeah.
I'm always just so pleased. And I'm always pleased with when you look at the quality of people involved, yourself, Jane, people who've been with the program since day one, a
Yeah.
number at the city, and Boyd. But then you look at people who have come along halfway through,
Yeah.
Jana Corby, um, Will Roberts. These
Yeah.
are folks that are now going to be carrying more of the weight as we carry forward. So you always have to have, we talk about fresh food, you also
Yeah.
have to have fresh people, new ideas, people that are keen. And that's where the strength in a program lies. You can always do a program for a couple of years, but if you're going to be committed to do it, and we've always been at the city that this is such a commitment in the summer, getting ready for the summer, but when we brought in our other commitments, it all really fell into place. It really, it you get that warm fuzzy feeling, and it is so true. And I'm so proud to talk about it in that light, because it is meeting a number of goals and objectives, not only the one from the environmental side, but
Yeah.
to be making contributions in the community on the food poverty side with those that just are not as privileged as others. These are the important pieces in building a stronger community. And we need that now more than ever as we head into the future. We have to close the divide, not increase the divide. And one way to do that is make sure that people of all ages, of all capabilities, get involved in these types of programs, whether it's the environment or on the poverty side. It's the strength by merging and collaborating together that I think has been so powerful and will carry us forward.
I do think, though, Jay, that, one of the things about the food bank is that we can hardly sneeze without people noticing, right? The food bank has 3,200 volunteers, for instance, on a regular basis. And, the media is interested. There are all these groups that we help with. The pandemic had helped to raise the profile of all these different efforts, of all these different groups. But what people underestimate is actually the power of a city department, let's say your department. We would never have been able to set up that fresh food thing the way that it happened if it wasn't for you. If it wasn't for your department, that blue box piece would not have happened, right?
Mm.
And now what we're morphing into now, we'll talk about that too next week in our next interview. But really, the department helped to pull that together. I think of the Food Policy Council. Now, for years, it was trying to find itself, so on and so forth. But you were part of that. Also, the city was part of that at the very beginning, along with the food bank, the London Community Foundation, right? The health unit, we all worked with that over time, but really the city gave it that kind of substance that it needed to move forward. And I don't think you guys ever got the credit for that. And then when I look at things like the Blue Box driver, now this fresh food thing, everybody comes along and says, "Oh, the London Food Bank is great. Look what you've done. It's fantastic." And I agree. Like I think it's all wonderful, and all these different community groups are taking part. But the city had a foundational part in all of that, and I'm just not sure how many people know that. So can I ask you a personal question on this subject, Jay, around climate change or these kind of things? Do you feel underappreciated? Like, do you? I don't think a lot of people know this kind of stuff of the things that your department has put together. Do you feel underappreciated, or you just kind of brush it off and just keep moving ahead?
Yeah, no, I'll say, Glenn, no, it's not about underappreciated or being appreciated. You join the public sector because you truly believe in helping people, and you're not here for glory. It's not looking for the pat on the back. Oh, it's nice when it occurs, but the pat on the back actually sometimes it almost feels too individual. You
Mm-hmm.
don't join the public sector to be an individual. When you pull together these initiatives, you're looking at the greater good. If not, if you're only looking about wealth and dividends and all that kind of thing, yes, stay in the private sector. That
Mm-hmm.
is where you have those opportunities. Now, saying that though, I'm not being critical of the private sector, because when you look at what they're capable of doing and have done in London, it
Yeah.
is incredible. So this is where the idea being is that there's little room for selfish people, and I've always looked at London as a wealth of volunteerism,
Yeah.
whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in poverty, whether it's in the environment. This is one big community that cares. So to be part of that, and keep in mind, at the city, we're paid. So we're not volunteers. When I work on the weekends, you know what? It's just all part of what I do. And I hate to use the word I much prefer working as a team, and that's the beauty of what has been at the city. So I work with a bunch of great people here that want to go the distance, and they're like me. They feel that additional warmth and value by helping in so many different ways. And I think we look forward to the food drive, no matter what it looks like. It's now called Curb Hunger. It's actually much easier to be involved in all these different capacities. And now bringing in the climate change component and the value of food and stuff we'll talk about more. And there's a financial value, but there's an environmental value and a lost environmental value. And that's stuff we'll talk about later, Glenn. But I'll tell you, I just look back and I'm just so privileged to be working here and helping and continuing to do not only my day job, but also my day job to help the community in different ways.
You know, that's just exactly how I knew you would answer that question, right? I just knew it. So I'm going to say that I think you're underappreciated. I don't think people have understood just how much the food bank, any part of the food bank's success on these issues would have been pretty hard for us if the city hadn't stepped in at times, resourced things at times, helped to promote things at times, even things like the Food Policy Council. I think it's really great, but I won't go there anymore because I know you're not going to say anything about that. But I do next time, Jay. I think, I know from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the FCM, and others, this climate change thing is kind of beginning to really find traction in communities across the country. And administrations and politicians at city halls across the country are having to try to get their head around that and what they are going to do for their component. And I would really like to talk about that next time as we come together for next week. But I really think it's interesting that you're now in your moniker there, in your position, climate change is now right at the front of that, right? And I think that that's really important. And I'd be really interested next time as we talk to see how that's changed your view of your role at the city and how it is that you feel that you have to morph that into the future.
No, that conversation is one I always welcome, because environment is so important. It's been important to me for decades
Yeah.
and many others, and how we all pull it together and how we tie it in actually with poverty too, because once
Yeah.
again, it's about voices. If voices aren't being heard, we must find a way to get those voices heard to make sure we're bringing everyone along.
Yeah. And we also, you and I, and our the city and the Food Bank again have a press conference coming up in a couple of weeks. So we'll talk about that next week. It's the Curb Hunger Drive again, but there's some new twists and new partners and new awareness. So it will be good to talk about that. I think that's going to be an exciting press conference, which we have at this time every year. But I've loved how this initiative has morphed so much in that time and has now brought in community in a larger way, but also fresh food in the climate. So we'll talk all about that next week. Jay, thanks for being part of this today. I know you're a busy fellow. I really appreciate it, but we'll do one more next week and we'll look at that broader picture and cities' roles in that whole idea of climate change. Thanks for doing this today.
Excellent. Thank you very much for this this conversation. It's so important, and look forward to our next one.